Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by the good people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
A couple of episodes ago, we talked about the fact that there are two sides to the FDA, yet people tend to only notice one. The one we notice is that the FDA protects us by keeping harmful foods and drugs off the market.
That's right, they save our lives.
Yeah, well, the unspoken assumption is that the FDA is the only thing that keeps harmful foods and drugs off the market, and if they didn't do what they did, then food and drug companies would just be wantonly killing off their customers. But that's a discussion for another day. The other side of the FDA, the one that people tend not to notice, is that it harms us by keeping helpful foods and drugs off the market. Another example of this hit the news this week. Cannabis and its derivatives have already been shown to relieve short-term chronic pain, reduce inflammation 30 times more robustly than aspirin, and mitigate the nausea from chemotherapy for cancer patients. A recent epidemiological study now links cannabis use to dramatically lower rates of cognitive decline and dementia. A study recently published in Current Alzheimer Research looked at 4,700 American adults and found that those who used cannabis recreationally had a 96% lower chance of developing cognitive decline. It's about time that we undertook a serious accounting of all the people whose lives the FDA has ruined. Not only those who might have benefited from cannabis and couldn't get it, but those who we threw in prison because they tried to help the people who wanted to get the cannabis and couldn't get it because of the FDA.
This is quite amusing, right? Because turns out maybe cannabis makes you smarter.
Who knows? But look, we didn't learn from alcohol prohibition. Maybe we'll learn from cannabis prohibition. But I'm not holding my breath because then again, maybe we just won't learn anything.
Although, on the happy side, there are a number of localities that are looking to decriminalize, and some that have decriminalized mushrooms.
Right.
That could be good fun in the not-too-distant future. There's been all kinds of pretty good scientific evidence that shows that psilocybin actually helps people immeasurably with certain mental conditions. The fact that we've had a government that has told us we can't even look into that over the last 6 decades
right,
is, I think, just beyond the pale. But let's go from one kind of growth to another, because I saw something that was especially terrifying this week. The headline is the stuff right out of horror movies. Mutated strains of an unknown drug-resistant bacteria somehow got onto the International Space Station.
Mutant strains. Now, of course, the assumption is they weren't mutant when they got on there. They became mutant in space, I assume.
That's exactly right. They grew independently of their Earth-bound counterparts while in space in new, fascinating, and exciting ways. I'm going to give you the money paragraph here. We'll put the link in the show notes for you. But here, Ant, see if you can find out what part I found particularly terrifying. A group of researchers took a closer look at bacterial strains on board the ISS and found that they had mutated to a different form that's genetically and functionally distinct from their earthly counterparts. In a new study published on PubMed, scientists suggest that bacteria in space becomes more resistant to treatment or drugs and are able to openly persist in the microgravity environment in abundance.
Oh, great. They made a superbug.
That's right. And the more you hear about how in order for the human race to survive, we will eventually have to leave this rock, well, guess what will be waiting for us when we do?
Right. We've already trained them. This is what a human looks like.
What could possibly go wrong? But sticking with the what could possibly go wrong theme, it's nice how they all link up together like this sometimes. We move on to the foolishness of the week. We did talk recently about my troubles with Google Fi and FedEx, but my troubles pale in comparison to this one poor suffering bastard who is a Verizon customer The good people at Verizon sent this poor man a bill for $439 million.
You said 439. I'm thinking, okay, well, in a bad month, that's equivalent to mine. No, the million part, that's new.
Damn near $500 million.
Good God.
Who the hell is asleep at the switch at Verizon that's even possible? Don't they have an upper limit on the bills they can send? I'm not a programmer, but I know it's pretty easy to put an upper limit on anything. Wouldn't the upper limit on a residential, private, what would you even call the type of account that a regular account?
Right, or just a regular personal.
A personal account. Don't you think maybe you should cap it at, I don't know, $500,000? Wouldn't that be better?
So here's my question. Did that number somehow make it to their books so that for a while they were reporting this as an account receivable, and now all of a sudden they have to adjust their anticipated profits?
They're going to be over 400 million light.
Right.
Their receivables in the coming months. Even the amount, $439,092,988 and no cents.
Well, at least that. They rounded it off.
How do you get to a number like that and not have all kinds of alarms triggering all over every computer system in the place?
Right.
You know, having been a Verizon customer in the past, I mean, look, I've made it pretty clear that I'm none too thrilled with Google Fi, and yet that's a world better than Verizon ever was. I guess the search for a rational cell phone carrier goes on for me, but oh boy, for this guy especially. And apparently he's got 10 days to pay it. Give him 10 days.
Oh my God.
I'm going to go out on a very thick limb here and say that I'm pretty sure he's not paying that.
Yeah. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. This week, our friend Judd Bristo joins us. We met Judd many years ago as we were going around giving lectures at high schools. Judd, I guess, contacted us and said, can we come down and give a lecture to his economics students, which we did, and we had a great time, and he had a great time, and they had a great time, and so he invited us back several times. So we've remained friends over the years, but Judd, in addition to being an economics teacher, is a realtor. An article came across my desk a couple of weeks ago about the National Association of Realtors reaching some settlement in which there's, I don't want to say they're admitting, but the settlement is a result of a class action suit against them about price fixing. And now there's this story about there's going to be lower commissions when you go to sell your house. And I forget where I posted this thing, but Judd said, hey, well, have me on. I can talk about this. I say, well, of course, you're a realtor and an economist. So, Judd, welcome to Words and Numbers.
Thank you for having me.
What's going on here?
Yeah, well, before you tell us what's going on here, how the does a high school teacher become a realtor?
Because being a high school teacher does not pay the bills.
But apparently being a realtor does, because you all had a class action lawsuit.
Or at least did until recent events.
Well, I got into real estate because my wife and I were both teaching. We were both at the same high school, even. And when you got two teachers working together, you can be pretty comfortable with that. But then when our daughter was born, we decided for my wife to stay home and raise her. And coaching and teaching was not paying the bills. Apparently, you don't get rich as a high school JV football coach who teaches economics. So I got into real estate on the side, and I've really enjoyed it. It's really been good for me. And I love that I get to tie it in or use it as tie-ins in my economics classes also. There's so much that just dovetails right in. It's really easy to explain markets when you work in markets.
All right, look, I've sold a number of houses over the past bunch of years. And Ant just sold one a couple of months ago, I guess, maybe even.
I sold one like 30 days before this article comes out. And I'm thinking, well, I should have gotten a break on my commission.
And look, when I've sold houses, that means I've bought houses as well, which means I'm getting rooked for 6% on both sides of this equation. Well, I'm getting rooked for 3% on either side of this equation. And probably not, right? Because really the buyer always pays this. Mm-hmm. Let's be honest.
I'm going to say this breaks out like a tax does. The market is going to figure it out. I would say it depends on whether it's a buyer or seller's market. That tax might be passed on to the buyer or absorbed by the seller.
Well, in some way or another, it's baked in.
6% is a healthy amount.
Yeah.
And we've all become quite accustomed to paying it until apparently a group of people who got all pissy about it sued. And now there's a gigantic $400 and something million settlement. Matter of fact, just about enough to pay that guy's Verizon bill.
Sadly, not quite enough. It's only 418 million.
But that's right. Now, not quite enough, but nonetheless, almost enough. So 418 million is nothing to sneeze at, but we'll talk about that later. What do we need to know about this?
Well, I guess I'll start with the current thing, and we can talk a little bit about history about it later too, because there's a lot building up to it. But essentially, this lawsuit came in 2019. Some buyers in Missouri sued, and they sued the National Association of Realtors and a lot of the large corporate brokers, Keller Williams, Remax, those types, about their practices being anti-competitive, about inflating commissions and inflating home prices and that kind of stuff. And so what they were really taking an aim at was what's called cooperative commissions. So in essence, if I am a seller's agent, if I'm listing a house and I come to an agreement with one of you to sell your house, and let's say, just because the number everybody's used to is 6%, I'm going to charge you 6% to do that, which then I'm going to split with the buyer's agent. Somebody brings me a buyer, I'm going to split that commission with them when we close. And they said, well, that's not fair because we shouldn't have to pay the buyer's agent. They're working for them. And a federal jury in Missouri agreed, and they came to an actual number of well over $1 billion. And then to quit appeals from going, they settled at that 418 million mark that we discussed.
Let's hold on a second right there, because as a seller, I want the house price to go way high. Mm-hmm. So if I'm paying a percentage commission on that, that's one thing. But if I'm a buyer, I want the sale price to go low, but my realtor is incentivized for the price to go high. We have a divergence of interest there.
We do. And that's where, you look at things like the National Association of Realtors has a code of ethics and things like that. However, let's be realistic. Individuals often are going to act towards their own interest. And unfortunately, that could mean acting against the interest of their client. So you have to be real careful when you're selecting a buyer's agent. And I think that one thing that will help from this, although I think a lot of the reporting has been overblown, that will give buyers an opportunity to have more say in how their agent is paid and make sure that they're working on their behalf. But notice, this is buyers doing that, but this lawsuit came from sellers. They were looking at this split commission thing as an issue because they said, we shouldn't have to pay 6%. You shouldn't have to split it. It shouldn't be locked in like that. And everybody's gotten so used to this 6% norm. But what's funny is when we hit 2020, 2021, and a lot of people started moving down here to Florida, we really started having inventory problems. So listing agents were really struggling trying to find listings. And what happened with that? Commissions started coming down. You're not seeing buyer's agents get 3% now. They're getting 2.5%. Seller's agents are getting 2.5%. They're getting a 5% total commission. I've even seen some where it's a 4%. Before all this went down, because now the listing agents are having to compete for homes to sell. They're pulling their prices down. We are seeing price competition, which was one of the main concerns of this lawsuit, that it was disallowing price competition.
Okay, so hang on. I want to back up and make sure I understand this. So you've got excess demand for housing in Florida.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which drives housing prices up.
Yes.
And that's good news for the seller's agent.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, as I'm understanding, is there are so many buyer's agents because there's so many buyers that competition should be driving their cut down. Is that what you're saying?
No, because very few agents are just listing agents or just buyer's agents. I work both. I've got a listing under contract right now while I'm working with buyers on another house at the same time. Where we're seeing the competition come in because buyers don't see that commission that their agent is getting. It's not anywhere on the listing that they see. So they don't see that. It's whatever the listing agent agreed to with the sellers. And that's actually in the contract I fill out with the sellers to list a home. I say, I'm going to charge you this % commission and I'm going to pay this much of it to the buyer's agent.
All right. So let me try again. because this goes back to what you said earlier, that the sellers brought the lawsuit. So I'm selling a house and there's supposed to be 6% commission, 3% of which goes to the buyer's agent. And my claim as a seller is I shouldn't pay 3%. There are buyers all over the place. Why should I pay 3% when anybody walking down the street to buy my house? That's
Right.
what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah,
Got it.
essentially. The thing is, though, and what NAR argued, and I haven't looked at the court transcripts or anything like that, but apparently they did not sway the jury, is that commissions have always been negotiable. Like I said, we've seen them falling here in my area in Central Florida for about a year or two now. I used to list things at a standard 6% just because that's kind of what we did. But I've had several times where I said, I do 6%, and somebody said, well, I'm not paying that. And I've said, well, let's talk about that. And then we come to 5 or 5.5 or whatever. It's negotiable. It's also negotiable what we pay to the buyer's agents. The only thing is that when I put the listing into the multiple listing service, in order for it to be listed there, I have to put something. Mm-hmm. Technically, that something could be 0. But I also know there are probably some unscrupulous agents out there who may look and say, well, I'm not passing that house on to my buyer if I'm not getting paid for it.
Well, why would they? Nobody works for free.
Right. There's 2 things that came out of this settlement that relate to, or that are going to affect consumers, because nobody gives a rip about the fact that the NAR has said they are still denying any wrongdoing or, the settlement amount. We can no longer, starting in mid-July, put that cooperative commission amount in our listings. So right now, if I go pull up a house on our MLS system and it'll say on there, they're going to pay the buyer's agent 2.5%. That's going away.
Okay.
But it doesn't say anything about not offering that. The NAR has actually offered guidance where they've said you can negotiate that in a seller's credit towards closing cost. You can call the listing agent and say, hey, what are your guys paying for this? What buyer's commission are they going to pay? So it concerns me that this is actually going to drive this more underground and more backroom deal kind of thing.
It hides it. Yeah.
Right. Because now if I'm a buyer's agent, I reach out to that seller's agent and say, hey, what are you willing to pay me to bring this person to you?
Okay, so not showing the buyer's share, or I forget the term you use, not showing the commission, would be akin to like the Uber driver. I call an Uber, it doesn't show him where I want to go until he picks me up, because otherwise he might just reject the thing. Okay. And so here, if I'm understanding you correctly, you don't show the commission, so the buyer's agent can't say, well, no, I'm not going to show this one because the commission is too low.
Right. And what's interesting is the argument against that is exactly the opposite. The idea of, if it only shows a 2% buyer commission, buyer's agents are going to steer their buyers away from that house and towards one that offers a 3% commission.
Right.
I just don't see that making a difference. And to me, it seems shadier to call up the listing agent and say, hey, what are you going to pay?
Mm-hmm. Well, Judd, what are the odds now that the percentage goes past 6?
I wish I had seen one that did that. I've never run into it.
If you're not making the amount public, there's no check on it.
Right. That's something that listing agents are going to still have to negotiate out with their sellers at the beginning when they're filling out that listing contract. But I mean, I have seen ones where, in fact, I've done this as a listing agent where it would say, hey, it's a 3% split and we're going to offer a $1,500 bonus if you bring in a full price offer by this date. Now you run into some other problems of, am I enticing this buyer's agent to work against their buyer's best interest to bring me a buyer because they know they're going to get even more money with a full price offer? I've done that as a listing agent and I've refused it as a buyer's agent.
I've got a question for you, because my wife kind of made it for a while, it was kind of her pastime to go through real estate listings. Mm-hmm. And she used to complain, the MLS, there was an MLS number, which I guess is identifier number for a property. It's universal. That was only available to realtors, or at least at the time. So she could see the listing, but couldn't see details of where it is or this sort of a thing.
Right.
Which made it, if you're in the market to buy, it made it necessary that you get a buyer's agent. So is it possible that we could move to a situation in which there are no buyer's agents? I see the need for a seller's agent, but why a buyer's agent? If everything's listed there, you can go and see the house. I can make an arrangement with you, the seller's agent, for a particular day to look at it, and that's kind of the end of the story, right?
Yeah.
I don't need an agent beyond that.
Kind of. But And in fact, prior to the 1990s, there were no buyer's agents.
Really?
Everything was just, that didn't come about to the 1990s, at least in the research that I've done. I was in high school not paying attention much of anything at that point. So I don't know for sure, but from what I've read, that's what it said. And you can, if you look at Zillow and all that, you'll see a lot of the information is up there now because information is key. The problem with excluding a buyer's agent is that's a person who should supposedly know the market and know what all this stuff means. You know how to go and look and try to figure out the value of something by looking at what else is selling for it. In a real estate thing, when a buyer says, well, I'm not paying more than this, but I want you to get me that house. I want that house. They don't understand the market necessarily what goes into that. So part of my job as a buyer's agent, and this is where I think I really lean on my high school experience also, is in education and teaching and holding people's hand through that process.
It's more than that too, right, Judd? The market is cornered. The market on information, and this is what Ant is getting at, I think, with the MLS business. Now, we can all look up MLS numbers now. It's easy to find them. But the market is still cornered by realtors, right? So when I want to go look at 40 or 50 houses, for me to be able to arrange that by myself would probably take me 3 years.
Yeah.
But a realtor has had me into 40 houses in the space of a week. Gets them all, organizes them, and off we go.
Yep.
Because that's his market. He understands that. I'm paying for that level of expertise, right? It doesn't have anything to do with much else because honestly, he's not on the hook when I start signing mortgage papers. Not really.
No.
That's on me. And realtors insulate themselves from that kind of thing pretty effectively. So what the hell are they good for? They're good for getting me into houses that I want to look at.
Good for that. And also for showing people how to compare, I think, between house 1, house 2, and house 47. You know, that can be a lot of daunting information. Like I said, it's a lot of hand-holding. It's a lot of coaching and teaching goes into that job. And it's also a lot that a lot of times never pans out because the people go, well, I just can't afford anything. And now you've shown them 40 houses and you've got nothing to show for it. But one of the things I think we talked earlier about the idea of working at cross purposes and buyer's agents being incentivized to not negotiate the price down or that kind of thing. And there's several different tools you can use for that. But I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is, and when I say a lot of people, I mean a lot of agents also, you do a lot better by being a rock star for somebody and getting them that lower price than you do getting that immediate return on a higher price for a little bit more commission. Because now those guys are going to tell everybody what a rock star I was. I had one family where I helped them buy a house. It was long distance, and I caught an inaccuracy in the way they described the pool. They said it was a concrete pool, and it wasn't. It was vinyl. And we got 30 grand knocked off the price of the house. And then it appraised for 20 grand more than we'd initially offered. So they had 50 grand of equity in it right there.
That was material to your bottom line, right? You gave up money for that.
I gave up money for that, but I also got 2 or 3 sales off of that because they recommended me to people.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Another thing I always point out is that, okay, I'm buying a house. I don't know how long I'm going to stay in it. And if the agent was great to get me in, I'll use the same one to get me out. The last house I sold in Utah, the real estate agent made a lot more on it than I did. Because she sold that house twice in 3 years.
Now, in looking at the settlement stuff, again, we can't, like I said, we're not going to, starting mid-July, we're not going to be able to put those compensation offers on the MLS. That's going to be on the back burner, or on the back side, I should say. But the other thing is now, before we ever act on a buyer's behalf, we have to have a buyer broker agreement signed. The NAR has always said this is a best practice. And I've worked for 2 different brokerages who have always said, do this before you really get in serious with somebody. But now the settlement is saying, you've got to do this before you start working with anyone, where it's going to lay out what the compensation is going to be. And this is where I think the biggest change is going to be and the biggest obstacles, because now some agents are going to say, well, I'm going to put it on the buyers. I'll make it a flat fee. It's going to be $3,000, to get you to closing on a house. Okay, that's great and all, but when we're in a cash-strapped society where a lot of our buyers are getting USDA loans or FHA loans because they can't afford a down payment and the closing costs, they don't have the cash to pay for that. If they're using a VA loan, they absolutely cannot pay for that. The VA says they cannot pay for realtor services. It has to come from the seller. So there's going to have to be some changes in there. I read a thing a couple of days ago that I think FHA and USDA are saying you can include a seller credit towards closing costs beyond the traditional limits of 3% or 6%, because it's a customary thing in your area that the seller pays for that. But that's still going to run into some problems, I think. And you're going to see a lot of buyers confused as to what they're actually going to be in for cash-wise trying to buy a house. And it's going to take a while for this thing to get sorted out.
We might have functionally screwed a bunch of people out of home ownership in the name of fairness.
Yes, that's my big fear.
Another thing comes to mind when we see the $418 million settlement, everybody goes, ooh, but the NAR represents 1 million realtors. That's $4 each.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing. It's chump change. It's not even the cost of a pack of cigarettes.
Who's getting that 418? Because I just sold my house. Am I getting a slice of that?
No, it's not going to be you.
No, you can try to join the class, but I think they've shut that down already. I'm not 100%
too late
sure.
now. Yeah, too late now.
It doesn't matter. It would have been 38 cents anyway by the time the lawyers are done taking their slice.
Exactly. I know it's 418 million, and from what I understand, 40% of that's going to lawyers.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, that's pretty common for a class action.
which is funny to me. 40% going to lawyers complaining about a 6% commission. But,
Oh my God, that's beautiful. Yeah.
That is doubtlessly the line of the episode. Nicely done, Judd. Nicely done.
thanks.
So, how does it all shake out? It's going to take time. And I understand exactly what you mean by that, right? There are all kinds of arcane rules that define the real estate market. And now we've got a superseding rule that's going to have to filter down to all the other arcane rules. And it's not clear at all, I suspect, how these two things are going to coexist. So, a bunch of things are going to be upended, but give it your best shot. What do you think it all ends up looking like in a year?
That depends on what Congress does with adjusting some of the rules for these government-backed mortgages, how much can be offered as a seller's credit towards paying closing costs for the buyer. It's going to depend on changes in the VA loan, but a lot of it is going to depend on what individual agents do to change their business model. I don't think this is going to have an impact on housing prices. I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on the cost that sellers take on to sell their home, because they're still going to want to pay. I mean, think of it as a finder's fee. They're going to want to pay something to that buyer's agent because they want those agents to bring the buyers. But it's going to require some creative marketing and some creative tap dancing about commissions from buyer's agents. How are we going to structure this? I've seen suggestions of people going to a $20 per showing kind of thing, or a flat fee for selling. And I just don't know. I've been running back and forth in my head about how I want to do it. I'm thinking I'm probably going to set, hey, here's the fee I plan to make based on your price range. And if your seller can cover that, great. If not, we're going to need to look at something else, and I'll reduce. Where it's really going to change is how buyer's agents structure their business and their commission schedule. I'm afraid it's not going to have an impact on home sellers very much, because they're still going to have to pay to bring buyers in.
And I imagine that of the two groups, the home sellers would have less of a problem paying it. And I know, being on both sides of that transaction, I never regretted the cut that I was paying when I was selling the house, because I've got this asset and I need it to move. It was on the buying end that I kind of felt a little bit, why am I paying this? I can go find this house myself.
But I think also a lot of people never, at least that I've looked at, they haven't looked at it as they're paying it. The seller is paying it.
Right. Yeah.
And that's something that got the NAR in trouble back in the 1950s, something called a free service rule. Maybe it was in the 1950s. I got to double check my notes, but they said, hey, the buyer's agent works for you for free. So I guess that would have been the 90s. No, they don't. It's baked into the price of the house. So
Sure.
Now, being an economics teacher, I've always tried to be very clear about that. But I mean, I've been amazed at how long the federal government's been fighting with realtors about stuff. It goes all the way back to 1939, even.
Listen, they're just following the government's example, right? Free education, free healthcare. The government can say it. Why can't they?
Yeah. Well, the Sherman Antitrust Act doesn't apply to the government.
Right. Right. The largest monopoly in the land.
The only monopoly in the land. Here's the thing, Judd. I mean, look, I've sold and bought enough houses in the last 20 years. I can tell you that these things are negotiable. Everything is negotiable. If you're not buying it at Walmart or Target, it's negotiable.
Yep.
when you're dealing with somebody who provides a service, it was always real easy for me to negotiate this. And actually, the more money you have, the more negotiable it gets, right? Because if I'm going to buy $1 million house, well, wouldn't you rather have 1.5% of $1 million than 3% of 180,000?
Absolutely.
It's the same amount of work, maybe less, actually.
Yeah. It's a lot less on the buyer side of that than it is on the seller side when it comes to that price level.
I mean, I actually had one realtor come in with all the papers, and she looked at me and she said, our fee is 6%. We don't negotiate. And I said, have a nice day.
Yeah.
And she went, did I say we don't negotiate? Let's negotiate.
I've had my commission negotiated down, but my goal is to provide for my family best I can. And like you said, I can do that a lot better on 2% of something than I can on 3% of nothing.
That's right. And look, most sellers and most buyers, I think, understand that realtors provide a service and they need to be compensated for that.
Yep.
That doesn't mean I want to pay them every dollar I've got in my pocket.
Yeah.
It also doesn't mean I want to screw them over in their ability to, as you put it, right, put food on the table. You know, it just seems that if this is a thing that has always been negotiable, what the hell is the problem here?
Well, what the plaintiffs argued in the case was that for a lot of the large corporate brokerages, they framed it as being not negotiable, like the lady you mentioned. And that's why they specifically targeted those. And I've worked for 2 separate brokerages, both of them just local little guys. My current supervising broker now, he owns his own brokerage. He's a retired Coast Guard chief petty officer who started doing this on the side himself too. You know, I love it because he depends on me doing my job right. So he makes sure I'm on the up and up too. I love these little brokerages where the broker has their thumb on what's right and what's wrong. And it's not some large corporate multi-state behemoth that's maybe putting in some shady practices or giving some wrong information.
Last question. Why? Why in God's name, when I buy a house or sell a house for that matter, do I have to sign a document 25 times? Why can't I just sign it once at the end?
25. And I sprained my wrist signing my mortgage last time.
Right.
And look, it's one disclosure after another, right? Let's be honest. By the 18th disclosure, you're not reading anymore.
No.
You're just signing at the bottom of the page.
It's all CYA for everyone that's involved, except for the buyers and sellers.
Except for the buyer and the seller who aren't reading it.
Yeah.
That's right.
And again, it's all CYA for everyone involved, and it's all driven by the states and the federal governments. And that's basically it. You got to release the title company from liability. You've got to release the realtor from liability. You've got to release everyone except for essentially the seller from liability. And that's where it all comes down to.
Judd, this has been great. If any of our listeners want to buy a house in Florida, where do they find you?
They can find me at juddbristo.realtor. That takes you right to my website. I'm also on Facebook, Judd Bristo Realtor. I'm friends with both James and Ant on Facebook, and I'm in the Words and Numbers group. I think I'm one of the founding members of that.
That's right.
So you can reach out to me through there. I don't know if I can give a plug for my phone number or not. Give me a call at 352-553-9490. You know, I can serve all of Florida. My brokerage has a couple agents down south, and we mostly cover Central Florida. Heck, I'll drive to Pensacola and spend a day on the beach while showing houses also.
Spoken like a true realtor.
Yeah.
So you have to stop plugging yourself now, or you never would.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Judd.
Well, thank you guys.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.